I'm super excited to have John Collins here, Director of Content and Intercom, on the show. John, welcome. Great to have you.
Thanks very much, Sergey. Great to be here.
Tell me about, so we spoke a little bit about the harsh weather conditions where you're
Harsh
at.
weather conditions here in Ireland. Yes.
But I wanted to jump straight in and talk a little bit about the point that you made when we chatted before about the difference between journalists and marketers, and specifically how differently they approach content production. How journalists are super fast and they've been trained to do that with a quick turnaround, versus marketers are so different. Talk to me a little bit about the difference in mindset and how does it affect these types of folks.
Yeah, so I think definitely one of the sort of strengths that journalists have and that they can bring to a marketing team, and obviously the early days of Intercom, myself, my own background, I worked as a journalist for nearly 20 years. We've hired a number of people who've got media experience in on their resume, and I think one of the things you learn there is the ability to get sort of high quality content out under deadline, how to get people sort of agree to sign off on things and on relatively quick turnarounds. I think you also get that like persuasiveness as well. So like, when we're doing customer stories and things, like being able to sort of like sell to people like, why do I have to talk to this person, or what's in it for me?
Mm-hmm.
And so I think all those things combine, and I also been very quickly able to spot like, well, this is an interesting story, and knowing where to dig maybe a little bit deeper. I think all of those things combine. If you're going to be producing a blog or some other, a regular podcast or whatever it might be that as part of your content marketing efforts, I think journalists have a unique sort of skill set there that allows them to publish quality content on a sort of an ongoing basis, on a pretty regular basis. And I think marketers generally are not sort of trained to do that, or it's not necessarily their strong suit. That's not to say marketers can't do it. Of course, there are some marketers who are excellent at that. Equally, I think there are some journalists who aren't necessarily able to see that that's sort of a resellable skill that they have, or a skill that they can apply in a different industry. And so, I've heard some excellent journalists work in our content marketing team. I've also worked with some amazing journalists in the past, and I would never think about hiring them for content marketing, because I think they're just don't necessarily see their skills in that light. But definitely it's something I've learned in the sort of six years or more that I've been doing content marketing.
What do you, when you are a journalist, how do you spot this good story? How do you spot the story that maybe is not quite developed yet quickly? If you have like a 24 hours to maybe 48 hours to turn around, what do you look for?
I think it's I think a big thing, and something I suppose that you need to be careful as a marketer. And I'll give an example. I think where you can go slightly wrong, but I think it's just like that interest and like curiosity of like, oh, I want to know more and I want to dig into this, and it's not just something you've heard 100 times before. And so, as you're thinking about your product, you're trying to think of like, oh, like this is interesting, this is different, it's a creative use of our product maybe, or something like that will actually help with your marketing. Where you can go wrong, and I remember this in the past, there was a company called Storyful who were like doing social media newsroom, sort of surfacing the stories that were out there on social media and verifying them, etc. And they were an Intercom customer, but actually they had sort of developed and kind of, I suppose, hacked effectively Intercom in very interesting ways for their own purposes. And it was a very interesting story. And like I wrote it up as a blog post, but the reality was we weren't going to sell any, no one else was, it was so unique to them
Very
that
custom.
it's not necessarily, it was an interesting story. It was a nice blog post, but it's not necessarily going to succeed from a marketing perspective. So I think you've obviously got to make sure that you're still, finding those interesting stories and surfacing them, but they're within like, hey, are we selling to that market? Are we selling to that use case? All those kind of things, all those kind of marketing guardrails, I think you still have to operate within. And that is I think where that overlap of journalism and marketing can be really, really powerful.
And we'll actually speak to that because I think you have some good examples to share. What about when you are, there's a lot of debate going on with quality versus quantity, and those are, it definitely will never go away. How journalists approaches quality versus quantity versus, let's say, marketers you have had a chance to work with?
Yeah. Well, so I think it's interesting you say that debate will never go away, because I've I think I've been on both sides of that debate myself over the years. I think when I started out in content marketing initially, it was like my instinct was just to create more and to publish more, because that's what you do. You write content or record content, publish content, and so it's a very natural instinct to do that. There does become a point for every company, I think, and for every brand, where you start to see diminishing returns. Like at Intercom, when I joined Intercom, we were probably publishing about two blog posts a week on average. We saw very strong returns on that, up to maybe 4 or 5 posts a week. And particularly, I think, in the early days of Intercom, because our audience, the people we were trying to sell to, it was largely smaller companies. There was a lot of startups, a lot of people in the kind of sort of product and design world. And they like to read blog posts. And particularly at that time, I think, like 5-6 years ago, the blog post consumption was probably higher. You didn't have as many podcasts and things around, or I think just generally the media world our media consumption hadn't got as fragmented, content consumption, whatever you want to call it. So we saw good returns up to, like, we were publishing for about a year, about five times a week. As we started selling to bigger customers, as we started like thinking very deeply about the different use cases that people might have for Intercom and the different audiences who would use Intercom within a company. So like, I'm talking about support leaders, I'm talking about marketers, I'm talking about sales leaders. We began to realize that, hey, not all those audiences are going to want to read like lots and lots of content. So I think, for instance, like, there's not a great amount of like high quality support content out there. I think most people would agree that, like, there's a lot of quite sort of light content there. So actually, I think for customer support, the number of articles you need to publish, or the number of books or guides or whatever it might be that you create, you can get a lot further with less, is what I'm trying to say. I think marketing's really, really crowded, and it's quite hard to break through that noise. And actually, marketers, by their nature, I think, read quite a bit. And then I'd say, like, on sales, just to give the third example of the sector we sell into, salespeople, tend to be time pressed. They don't necessarily want to read your 1,200 word thought leadership article on, like, the latest sales developments. They're like, give me the information, I want it now, and so we found video is a really effective medium. Short, snappy, like high sort of signal to noise ratio videos performed really well when we were trying to reach a sales audience. So I think there's no one answer for like frequency of publishing. I think it comes down to really, who your audience are, what size of companies you're going into, etc., and really just approaching that in a really methodic, thoughtful way.
When you are, let's say you are in a crowded place, maybe you're producing 2 pieces of content per week, and other folks will be producing more. There's this argument, or there's this fear that people have, like, oh, like, I will be less seen. And it's in a way, it is true that you're less seen. But if you are, for example, producing higher quality piece of content that people look forward to, would that still be an argument that, oh, you're not hitting the frequency or the volume?
Yeah, well, I don't think just staying on the treadmill is the answer if you're in a crowded marketplace or crowded content space. So, for instance, well, then why not think about surfacing things from that you've published previously? Because if it's that crowded a marketplace, people haven't seen it. One of the most successful sections of our newsletter over the years has been when we include a sort of like a piece from the archives, like a in case you've missed it piece at the bottom of the newsletter, which is basically just a way for us to surface another blog post that we think deserves a second life. And quite regularly that is like in the top 2 or 3 links clicked on in the newsletter. So I don't necessarily buy that argument. Then there's the whole piece of like not just resurfacing stuff, but like looking at that as an opportunity to go back and optimize existing content. I think then also you might want to ask yourself, as I mentioned, say with the sales audience, we realized that video was a great way to reach
Mm-hmm.
them, and it didn't have to be sort of like highly produced, very polished video. It was just like very direct, sort of, with a lot of information in it. Worked really, really well. So I think again, maybe think about, is there other ways to reach this audience? If everyone in your space is going, oh, we're like publishing loads of blog posts, for instance, well then maybe think of some other way to reach them. But I don't think necessarily contributing to, hey, let's just like bring out the big guns and we'll just more. It doesn't make sense, because I think generally one of the sort of guilty secrets of the content marketing world is a lot of content doesn't perform or doesn't get seen. And so why contribute to that problem and just publish more? I don't think it's good for anyone.
It's a great point. If you have great content, then you might not have an audience. Then figure out how to get an audience, or figure out how to get access to the audience, and then distribute that content versus produce more content to no audience, right?
Exactly. It is that old cliche about Einstein saying that the definition of madness is continuing to do the same thing. Well, don't just the solution is not just, oh well, I produce more content. I think the solution is to get creative about getting that content in front of the right people.
And I've heard it from other people, and I previously, a couple of months ago, slowly started to realize that it's true. Where firstly, there's no one size fits all, but then there's also this advice from Gary V's of the world where you absolutely have to produce more content. If you're not producing 5 pieces of content a day, then you're lost. And okay, it is probably true for some people, for certain industries, but then that model does not apply to everybody.
Yeah, no, and I think like you want to think about like engagement as well. Like you don't want to just like be like almost this brute force sort of like, if I keep publishing 5 times a day, or like, it's not always necessarily publishing in terms of a new post or something, but it's like social posts, it's YouTube. But it's a very much a kind of a brute force attack approach. And I think actually what you want is more kind of like, can I produce like one thing a day or one thing a week that actually gets engagement and actually gets a discussion going, or, the people go, oh, those guys at Intercom, or those guys, those guys in the Media Camp podcast, they're producing good stuff. I want to go and like, there's just so much noise out there at the moment, we're all trying to break through noise, and like we've all become these like really distracted people who are like constantly like, getting pings about new things. I really think like we all, whether in our work lives or our private lives, we are all starting to appreciate the more sort of like thoughtful, more insightful pieces. And that doesn't necessarily have to mean like long form or things like that. Like they can be quite short things, but they just deliver you good quality content that you want to engage with. I think is much more important than like volume of content.
Yeah, just figure out either jump on a different treadmill or configure the treadmill for yourself.
Absolutely.
So I want to talk about when you jumped into Intercom from being a journalist for so many years. What was different? How did you feel when you started?
Well, everything is quite different. I mean, as I said, media world, and particularly I was in what was a daily newspaper of, and making the transition to online, but it was all about like always on, always publishing. And I think that was probably a big change for me, was going through that sort of thought process of actually like, okay, like we now plan by quarters and we have quarterly goals and we have a chance to think more strategically, and to stop that sort of like, as I say, even though we did get up to publishing 5 times a week on Inside Intercom, that was, probably 18 months, 2 years after I started, and it was like when a team was in place. But I think even initially, like it was sort of, Des Trainer, who was heading up marketing around that time, said to me, like, just, you don't have to publish every day. That's not the yardstick you're going to be measured on. It's not that kind of, as you said, like the kind of advice you see from a lot of influencers of like, just keep getting into people's feeds and making sure you're at the top of the feed. And just having that time to think strategically and like what's going to move the needle, like what do people who are buying Intercom need? Like what kind of what kind of things can we publish that they're going to be willing, say, to give us an email address for, so that we can start to have, they can become leads, and we can start like a relationship and a discussion with them that hopefully ends up with them becoming a valuable customer. And I think, just the media world, in contrast, is, under a lot of pressure to produce, with less people working in the industry, produce more than ever. They're being read more widely than ever. And so there's just this intense pressure all the time. And it's very hard to sort of, meanwhile, they're trying to figure out what their business model is broken and come up with a new business model. And so, like, it's very, very different. The working in-house in a software company that, and by its very nature, Intercom is very much a product-first company. So very thoughtful in the approach to how we solve problems. Always kind of go back to first principles. We don't necessarily jump to, like, an immediate response. We think about, like, the jobs to be done methodology has been very influential at Intercom. So we always try and understand the problem that our customers have, and like what they're trying to use Intercom for, and really understand then how we could, better solve that problem. And then, as I said, the jobs to be done helps us think about, like, why are people hiring Intercom? Like, what is the job that they're using Intercom for? And so I think that to me was the big change, that it's, a sea change in terms of both pace and sort of, intensity is the wrong word, but, just it was definitely more a chance to sort of be more strategic rather than to be very tactical of, like, hey, we've got to get a newspaper out tomorrow.
And now, a couple of years fast forward, I think you mentioned now everybody wants to work at Intercom, or former journalists want to work at Intercom. Is that because you have the brand, you have success, and also the fact that journalists are unfortunately in this weird position right now where, like, the business is suffering? Is that like those two combination factors?
Yeah, and like Intercom is a software company that, has invested in content marketing and sees that, like, content marketing has been really successful, and it's probably, like, the one of the things we're well known for in the market. In fact, there's been times over the years where people are like, hey, love your content, what do you guys do? Which is not great, because actually, it's content marketing, and the point is we're doing this so that people know who we are, and know what we do, and potentially will buy our product. But I say I used to write and edit things so that people would, buy a newspaper or buy a digital subscription. I now write and edit things, and the team write and edit things so that people will buy software. And so in that regard, it's not that dissimilar, but you do have to be very conscious of, like, what we're creating. We're not just creating stuff just to generate an audience for the sake of generating an audience. And that's publishing is about just, creating an audience that you then either advertise to or ask them to, like, pay for the content. But, content marketing is very different. You are trying to attract the right audience that will be in the market to buy your product.
Yeah, similar intent, different vehicle, different approach. How do you do that?
Yep.
You mentioned this great point that I was about to talk about. Companies that create content that is not tailored to the product, where, like, you just said, like, you have great content. Oh, what do you do? That's not necessarily a good reaction. What happens? And I think you had example of really successful companies that are they're invested a ton of money into creating very high quality content that definitely helps the audience, but doesn't quite help them with the sale of their product.
Yeah, I think we've seen that a lot. Like, a lot of, particularly in the technology world, a lot of brands develop these, like, kind of sort of content sub brands, and it could be like a blog and an event series. Like, they might have a conference with the same name, and they really, like, try and go deep on, something tangential to actually what they do. And I get it. People are creative. They want to create something that's going to attract an audience, but it doesn't necessarily attract the right audience. Just because you're in the customer support world, should you just write all about relationships because, customer support is about relationships with customers? Probably not. I don't think that lens is close enough. So the way I talk about it, Intercom, is to sort of keep ourselves on the right path, is talk about like seeing the world through the lens of our product. And so at Intercom, and how we stay brand relevant in terms of the content we produce, at Intercom, our product, we have a customer engagement product, and it very much, the product itself does not make it easy for you to send a message to your entire customer base, because actually we don't think that's the right approach. We have we've just released Series, which is a new visual designer for how you create these kind of engagement campaigns, but you send targeted messages to people, the right message to the right people at the right time. And, our engineers have written code that, allows you to do that in the product. Like our editors write articles that help you to do that, give you advice on how to do that. We've written a book on customer engagement. We've written guides to different aspects of customer engagement, whether that's, writing the right kind of messages or, how to create campaigns and stuff. And so that content is going to attract people then who are like, not just in the market for Intercom, but I think when they then log into the product, it doesn't feel like they've entered a different world. I think we've all seen that where, companies are very marketing led, sometimes can have this amazing marketing, you really buy into the story and the vision, and then you actually buy the product or service, and it really just doesn't match what you feel you were sold by the marketing. And I think with content marketing in particular, I think that you can be really, really exposed and sort of have a disconnect there, and end up having a content marketing program that's popular, that's like generating reads or listens or whatever your metric is for it. But is it actually then turning that into business? Is it actually creating leads on that, based on that? And I think that's the hard part, and that's why you have to kind of think about this brand relevancy all this time, and as I say, seeing the world through the lens of your product.
Is it the problem because there's no content created about the product or helping the customer when they're already logging into the product, they're trying to use it? Or is it the problem where when they talk about the top of the funnel, when they create top of the funnel content, the positioning of the product, how they sell it, is incorrect? Or both?
I think it's the latter. And I think when we're talking about sort of content to help people use the product, we talk about product education content. That's different, and like it's really, really powerful, but that's a different team than content marketing. And it's can be equally impactful from an SEO perspective. Like the reality is, people will, before they buy a product, will Google about it and probably end up in your help center and your documentation, because they'll want to go, how do I integrate this thing with this other tool I use? And guess what? When they Google that, they're going to find your help doc. So certainly don't underestimate product education and the power of that kind of documentation. But no, I think the big issue is at the top of the funnel, and basically people are attracting the wrong kind of the wrong kind of buyers, the wrong kind of intent, and I think they're like the other thing is the original days of content marketing. I think there was a lot of there was a lot of green space for people to go after, and so like the whole thing became, you have to go after high volume keywords. That's the name of the game, and like it's all about like high volume SEO. But reality is, just because someone's Googled customer support, it could be that they're looking for customer support for like a problem they're having themselves. Maybe they're looking for customer support software. A small percentage of them are. There's all sorts of different things that could be in there. Whereas actually, if you look at like someone searching multilingual help desk, it's probably quite a small volume, but the intent is really, really high.
Right.
And so I'd really say definitely in the B2B space, you're far better after going after those sort of high intent, but not necessarily high volume keywords. You'll attract the right people. And again, I think it's not just informed from SEO, but just generally with your content strategy, thinking about, as I said, about the world, like what's relevant to your product. Because, if it was just a numbers game, it's just about getting visitors to the site, as I said, I've hired a number of like people who work in the media world. We can get clickbait and click-throughs and all that stuff. We can generate traffic, but is it going to move the needle for our business? Probably not.
Right. No, I mean, you're doing it very well. You've been doing it for a long time, and you have to. Effectively, that's the whole point of the model. There's this. I was curious to hear your perspective, John, on this. So you said it. If you're, let's say, doing customer relationships, that's what your product is. there is
Hmm.
also an approach that is based around, well, why don't we create content around golf? And how does it relate? Well, golf happens to be one of the interests that your audience has, and it's like, well, it doesn't relate at all. But what folks are saying is that, well, they will look at your golf content and then they'll figure out what you do. I'm very curious to hear what's your take on that type of approach that is completely outside of what you do.
You better have very patient sort of paymasters because it's a long route, right? And you're also sort of, I'm sure you've chosen golf as a sort of an extreme example, but even,
Yeah.
if you say it's, in your sector and it's related or whatever, it's like, but hey, the people who buy our product are really interested in this other thing. Well, then you're putting a huge burden on sort of your conversion rate once you get them to your site. And how are you going to convert them? And how are you going to get them from that other content over there to the core of what you do? And so I think that's why I would certainly not be an approach I would recommend. And maybe there's some extremely crowded markets where you just have to do something where it's, you're just trying to break out and in some way get the traffic. But I'd have to be convinced that it's the best approach.
Right. No, that's interesting because yeah, I mean it's one of the things that Gary Vee, for example, among others, advocates for.
Mm.
Where if you're a lawyer, well, then start a podcast about tennis or about surfing,
Yeah.
which is interesting. But I mean, I think with that approach, it also relies heavily on the relationships that you're building one on one during the podcast or doing an interview, and that
Mhm.
could work in that specific medium. But if, for example, from your perspective, you look at it from the written content, that would be a huge climb. That would be tough to try to sell it.
Yeah, and obviously there's a lot of focus these days about account-based marketing is really big, and how sort of personalized or how tailored should your content be? Like, should you actually be like creating a blog post or a guide or a book or something for a specific account? If it's big enough, does that make sense? And maybe if your sort of average ACV, average contract value is our annual contract value is that high, you can make that stack up. But generally, I mean, we like the kind of content marketing we have focused on today at Intercom is that kind of scale content marketing. And so yeah,
Mm.
it's that balance between sort of making sure it appeals to as many people as possible, but yet at the same time being relevant and being comfortable that actually, some high intent content, content that's going to be read by people who have a high intent to buy your product is the way to go.
What's your thinking behind SEO? You mentioned it. Like when do you start with SEO when you're working on a piece of content? You're thinking about a piece of content. Are you thinking it straight away? Are you thinking about it afterwards, or you're not thinking about it at all? What's your philosophy behind that?
I like to say we're SEO informed rather than SEO driven. I think the problem sometimes with SEO driven is just that you are effectively optimizing for the algorithm rather than optimizing for the reader. And so I kind of make the comparison to a Happy Meal, that overly optimized content feels like a Happy Meal. It kind of looks like it's going to be good. You've kind of convinced yourself that it's going to be satisfying, but you consume it, and 15 minutes later you're hungry again. And I think overly optimized content is like that. You go, oh great, I found this explainer to this topic, but it kind of never goes really very deep. It doesn't really say anything that you can't get anywhere else. In fact, it's probably just the result of a bunch of desk research that someone relatively junior in an organization has done. And so I think it's, again, it'll get you a certain amount of volume, particularly if you go after the high keywords, but it's competitive. But how much will you be able to convert that traffic? Whereas I think be SEO informed, we come up with sort of things, editorial topics that we know from understanding our audience, and like investing in
Hmm.
user research and just getting to understand our audience. Like I have a whole uh, team within the content team who are called the audiences team, and they just think about like the potential buyers and become experts in that space. And so they will come up with topics, and then we will actually look at like, okay, what are the SEO implications? Like, have we, we already gone after that keyword a bunch of times? What's the volume like? All these other things, and just, as I say, make sure that like we're not ignorant of SEO. Far from it, but don't let SEO drive the whole operation.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Where you have a bit of a balance versus creating content that kind of feels like those affiliate websites when you're thinking, oh, what's the fastest skateboard,
Yeah,
and they're like, oh, and then they start with like the definition of the skateboard. Like, you don't
yeah,
want the definition of the skateboard, you want a specific answer. And there's like a 15-page article.
yeah. Well, that's totally driven by trying to get the definition box on the SERP on the results page, so that because that's P0 as some people call it. That's the holy grail, isn't it? That you answer the question on Google's results page.
Exactly. What do you look for, John, when you're evaluating the content? What matters? What's some of the metrics you really want to hit, and what are some of the metrics you are okay to ignore? Because I would assume it's not all about page views and time spent on site. Maybe it's a nice one, but like, what's some of the metrics you would be okay to ignore, and some of the core ones that if you hit that, that's work well done. Maybe you kind of revisit it later, but initially when the content piece is out, that's pretty good.
Yeah, so I think time on page is definitely important for us. Pages per session is another important one as well, so that people are not like just consuming one article and disappearing. I think we increasingly are making sure that like the content attracts people in the right segment. So we're looking for people. Right now we're looking for people in sort of 100 plus employee companies, slightly bigger companies than we would traditionally have sold to. I mean, that's where our sort of net new content creation is focused on. That's just like to tie in with our broader marketing strategy. So we're using things like Clearbit and stuff to make sure that we're attracting those kind of people. Obviously, as I say, content is one of the 4 pillars of marketing in Intercom, and so we partner with the other teams to make sure that if we're pushing our support solution this quarter, we're going to be going strong on that, and seeing like how is traffic to our support content, tracking against that. But I think it's important not to totally sort of say, oh well, top of funnel like volume of traffic doesn't matter. It does, because you're trying to in classic marketing funnel sense, you're trying to attract people into that. You're trying to attract new people in all the time, because otherwise you're just gonna when you pass on leads further down the funnel, if you're not getting new people coming in, you've got a real problem. So I think the day that we report or don't look at a KPI of traffic, we'll have a problem.
No, that's a good approach. That's a well balanced approach. I want to talk about your podcast.
Sure.
You've been having some great guests. You've been doing it for a long time now. What do you do to make sure that you have great conversations? Like, what's your thinking behind that?
Yeah, so I mean, I think we've a pretty simple formula, and it's one we've kind of stuck with for the last, gosh, it's over 5 years since we launched our podcast. And in 2015 there wasn't a lot of brands or companies doing their own podcast. Whereas now I think nearly every startup in San Francisco seems to have a podcast rather than a blog when they start off. I can understand why, but it's a pretty crowded space. But we looked at the options. We looked at like partnering with different production companies or what have you, that like could have helped us produce say a magazine style or sort of a very documentary style podcast. But going back to what I talked about, seeing the world through the lens of your product, was that we realized that, hey, Intercom is all about conversations with your customers and sort of having that deeper sense of, our whole mission is to make internet business personal. And so we felt we'd like to have deep conversations with people we respected in the industry. But I think one particular thing we noticed at the time, particularly in the technology podcasts, was that you know, a lot of them were overly long, a little bit rambling, and so you know, it was quite common to have like 1 hour podcasts that people were listening to on, you know, 2x speed, and it was just like, well, why not just actually, you know, curate a conversation, like a 30-minute conversation. We produce a document in advance that we share with the guest. It's like, hey, here's 10 questions we want to try and cover. We might cover all of these, we might ask them exactly in the way we say here, but like, here's 10 things that we think are interesting about you and your work. And we will even go to like sort of give like, you know, hey, we're asking this question because you sent this tweet out last year, or hey, we're asking this question because, like, you know, you spoke about this at this conference. Yeah, and so it just really sort of makes it easy for them to go, oh, cool, I know what these people want to talk about. I know, like, they're focusing on what's interesting. They can make suggestions, we make suggestions. So there's an agreed sort of path beforehand. So it's, yeah, and we generally hit sort of 35-minute mark. And I think the big thing, two big things was from an early stage within the company, you know, Intercom was probably about 100 people at the time when we launched, was we asked everyone, like, we had people who'd worked in Apple and Facebook and you know, all these different big companies, was like, who do you have a personal connection with that, like, is sort of the most famous in our industry that, you know, that you think you could like ask to come on our podcast? Because, you know, we sort of cold contacted people, the first thing they were going to do was look at our podcast and go, who's been on this thing, like, is this thing credible? And so that really helped. Actually, I remember, I think it was Margaret Gold Stewart, who was a VP of design at the time at Facebook, was one of our first big guests that really unlocked a lot of doors then for other guests who are just made them feel comfortable, like, hey, this isn't some Mickey Mouse thing that I'm going to be on. And then the second thing I think that has really helped with growth, and was just something that, you know, it was actually someone who was trying to sell me or get me to start using a tool he was building for podcasters, but he said, listen, you guys need to just like release at the same time on the same day every week. And he was like, this thing, like, because at the time we were sort of getting them out as and when we could, and seeing if there was an audience. And it was a fantastic piece of advice, because since, you know, the audience almost doubled within a couple of weeks once we hit that regularity. Like, if you think about your own subscriptions to podcasts, people like that, knowing when there's going to be new content there. And I think that just makes a huge difference.
That's a great point. I mean, great points. With regards to sending questions beforehand, do you do like pre-interview calls? Do you actually meet the guests beforehand, or you just send it over the email because you're going for famous guests who did previous public appearances? You don't need to actually talk to them before you actually start rolling.
It's a mix. It depends. I mean, generally we can do it on the doc, just by exchanging emails and sharing the document. But obviously, you know, depending on who it is and their comfort level, we'll just make a call on it. But we have a dedicated podcast producer now as well, which is, you know, we've only had for the last sort of year and a half, which is great. Makes a huge difference. And, you know, now I think we also have the luxury of, it's not even always looking for the most well-known person. We're also looking for like someone who's got an interesting story to tell, and we think that will resonate with our listeners.
When you look for the right story or the great story, what are some of the sources that you look for? Would that be they did previous public interviews, they did previous podcasts, maybe they've been on YouTube, they wrote something interesting, or would you look for something else as well?
Personally, I'm probably still a little old school, and I sort of have my sort of Twitter lists for different topics. So I'll just go like, who's actually saying interesting things, or like watch what people I respect, like, are they sharing articles or like talks or stuff from other people. But yeah, it comes from a variety of sources, and I think particularly you know, something we've been trying to focus on a lot more recently. Well, not just recently, but we're always conscious of, but I think, you know, events of this year have made everyone conscious of, is diversity and inclusion, and making sure that like, whether that's, you know, gender diversity or racial diversity or whatever it might be, just trying to be thoughtful and conscious about that. And I think, you know, one of the things that made us realize is that, like, actually, you know, when you get someone from a particular group that maybe has been underrepresented, you sort of say, hey, who else is interesting? Like, who do you listen to? So, like, use your existing sort of guests and contributors as a way to sort of find more interesting guests and contributors, and regardless of what sort of lens you're applying to that at a particular time.
You probably have to run, John, but I have a last question. You don't have to spend too much time, but I'm curious to hear what you think. If you were to start, if you have to start a podcast right now, crowded space, let's say customer relationships, how would you approach the concept development? Maybe it's the name, maybe it's the type of guests, maybe it's the conversation, maybe it's the format. What would you consider or ask kind of questions about maybe people you reach out to that to bring that fresh perspective that folks are not doing because nobody wants another podcast?
Yeah, I think, well, certainly if it's in the customer support space, I think, I think there's definitely opportunity there to sort of, there's a lot of very light content in the space. And so, to me straight away, I'd start thinking about, oh, is there some stuff here that we can, in a healthy way expose some of the realities of what's going on in that space. So whether it's like talking to, agents or something, and actually exposing their voices, which aren't necessarily heard. But I mean, that's kind of like just riffing off the top of my head. But I mean, I think the big thing for me always is do the research, look at what's existing, look at what's out there right now, and then sort of form an opinion yourself. I mean, that's definitely how our podcast launched, was very much looking at like what existed at the time, and figuring out like, could we offer something different? And I think, that's probably just a bit of my personal style as well. It's just like, hey, like let's do something different. But I think the proof is in the pudding in many ways, in that, like, people don't want just more of the same. If you're just going to offer more of the same, how what's unique, or why would people sign up for it?
Right. And you have to do golf example because you don't have to go that extreme to be successful.
No. You will not hear a golf podcast from Intercom, I promise.
Not in the next couple of years.
No.
until
Not
while you're here.
Reign.
Exactly. I was just going to say, John, what are some of the resources you'd recommend people to check out? How do they can find you? Anything that you think would be helpful for the audience?
Well, obviously check out the Inside Intercom blog. If you want to check out my thoughts, I'm on Twitter. I'm JC001, so JAYCEE001, and I'm also on LinkedIn. If you obviously find John Collins Intercom, I'm happy for people to follow me there as well, post occasionally. But I think there's some great resources like generally out there at the moment, and some great Slack groups for people who are interested in content marketing, that you can easily Google and find. I think that's interesting as well. So just some great, these private Slack groups happening that people are sharing their knowledge and their insights.
Any final messages to the audience? Something I have not asked you. You wish I did.
Well, I think the one thing we kind of touched on tangentially, and we had discussed previously, I think, was just this whole idea, which I always say to people is, have an opinion, be opinionated, and that doesn't mean you have to be angry or contrarian, even though sometimes you want to be, but like, just an opinion is something that people can disagree with, and your content should always, it shouldn't be playing it so safe that everyone in your industry can agree with it. It should have an opinion, which is basically a stake in the sand, where you're sort of saying, well, actually, everyone thinks this, but maybe we need to consider this. And so I think that's just one of those things that you constantly want to keep in the back of your mind as you're producing content. If it doesn't have an opinion, how are you going to get it read or listened to?
John, that was a lot of fun. Thank you so much for being here and sharing your insights.
It was great to be here. Hopefully your listeners get some use out of it.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.